Good morning, everyone. Welcome to week 2, lecture 2, our second lecture on supply. I'm going to begin the lecture just by revising a couple of concepts that we did the other day, and then we'll build on our model of supply. What we are doing today is looking at the supply curve. And what I really want to explore to you is the shape of the supply curves. And the reason it's important to consider the shape of the supply curve is that it gives us an understanding about our costs. So for that reason, I want to start by just looking at going back to where we were on Tuesday and talking to you at the beginning about factors of production that are fixed, and then we'll move on to factors of production that are variable. So on Tuesday, we looked at fixed factors, and we had our table, and I think it was in our third column of our table, we saw that some factors of production do not change across the range of output. So, for example, we might imagine ourselves to be running a small business, perhaps a coffee shop, and we're going to have some factors of production which don't change, even though the output does change. For example, the rent of the coffee shop will be the same whether we make one coffee or whether we make hundreds of coffees. The coffee machine will be the same cost to buy, whether we make one coffee or many coffees. So this is a fixed factor of production, and therefore it leads to this concept of the fixed cost, and this cost doesn't change even though our output might change. So it's a constant cost. And even fixed cost will also, the other factor about fixed cost, or the other characteristic of fixed cost, is that the fixed cost still exists even though the business might actually be closed over a given period of time. Many firms will shut their doors for the weekend, but they are still paying their rent on a weekly basis. They're still paying rent on a Saturday and Sunday, even though the business may not be producing anything on a Saturday and Sunday. So this is the aspect of the fixed costs. So let's just go down to our slide, and we can see here that when we look at our fixed cost, we can see that this fixed cost is $100. And that cost is the same whether we're producing 0 goods or whether we're producing 135 goods. The cost doesn't change. What does change when we're looking at fixed cost is the average fixed cost. The average fixed cost does change. So this is the fixed cost. The fixed cost averaged across the number of output that we are producing. So the way that we get our average fixed cost is to say, what is the fixed cost? The fixed cost equals $100. And then we look at the output. Let's imagine that the output is 40. Right? Imagine that we look at the output here, or our production, our quantity, if you want to use a different word, and this will become 2.5. But then when we move down the column and we get down to 135 goods, we see that the fixed cost is exactly the same. So to work out the average fixed cost at the bottom of the column, of course, it's $100 on 135 goods, which I think comes out to approximately 75 cents. So the average fixed cost, you can see that as the output grows, the average fixed cost goes from $2.50 for the first 40 goods to $75 cents when we get to produce 135 goods. If we only produced one good, imagine that this is coffee and this is our average. This is our average fixed cost for the coffee. If we only produce one good, it would mean we'd pay $100 in rent to produce one coffee. So the average fixed cost there would be $100 a coffee. It would be a very expensive coffee. Large firms are able to lower their costs. They're able to benefit from mass production or get economies of scale because they essentially average their fixed cost over many, many millions of units of output. So the greater the level of output, the lower that average fixed cost becomes. So we can see that our average fixed cost curve is falling. And I'm going to draw a curve to show you the shape of that average fixed cost. I think I may have done this the other day, but I'll do it again here just for the purposes of revision. So on our vertical axis, we've got the cost, and on the horizontal axis, we've got the quantity. And I want you to imagine, for example, or to start with, we've just produced one good. What would be the average fixed cost? Well, we've got $100 of fixed cost. So I've drawn a dot at the top. We imagine that to be $100. But what would the average fixed cost when we get out here to 135 goods? Well, the average fixed cost, of course, is much lower. So our average fixed cost falls a lot to begin with. The average fixed cost of one good would be 100. The average fixed cost of two goods would be 50. And the average fixed cost of three goods would be 33. So that the curve falls very fast to begin with and then continues to fall, but more and more slowly. So that's our average fixed cost curve. And I want you to sort of take notice of that curve for the moment because we'll be coming back to it. We'll be coming back to it later. All right then. So then let's move on to the average. I want to move then over to the other side of the table, because what we're going to do with this average fixed cost is bring this average fixed cost over and insert it next to the average variable cost. And that way we can know what our average total cost is. So this average total cost is going to be the sum of our average fixed cost, which we've just dragged over, which I'm circling at the top. So it equals our average fixed cost, plus our average variable cost. And here I'm drawing a square around our average variable cost column. So that brings us from our fixed cost to our variable cost. So let's just then consider our variable cost. Where is our variable cost coming from? Our variable cost is coming from the fact that as well as hiring the building or the premises of the business, we also have to hire the workers. And we're paying each of those workers $12. I know we did some of this the other day. We're paying each of these workers $12. So if we multiply one worker by the $12 we're paying them, then that total variable cost will be $12. But if we multiply that one worker or four workers by $12, we get $48. So the variable cost column, is just the number of workers. It's column 1. I'm putting a dot there, times 12. And that gives us our variable cost. So that's our total of our variable cost. But when we work out our average of our variable cost, how do we get the average variable cost? Average variable cost. That will equal our variable cost. So if we draw a line through two workers, I'm circling the two workers. I'm circling the money that we pay the two workers. That's $24. So we put that $24 over the 90 goods that they make, and that gives us our average variable cost curve. So which two columns are giving us our average variable cost? Which two columns give us our average variable cost? The variable cost curve, obviously, and the quantity. Those two give us our average variable cost. The quantity comes over. We put that on the bottom, and of course we put the variable cost on the top. So that's our average variable cost. And you'll remember then that if we've got across the first line, we've just worked out our average variable cost. Think about the variable cost, our first line. I'll just use the eraser and then we'll do it for the first line. So the average variable cost curve when we employ one worker, I've put a little one there, is $12 for the worker over 40 goods. And that's where we get our 30 cents from. We get our 30 cents. And then you'll remember from our previous table, the average fixed cost is $2.50. So let's put the 2.5 in, 2.5, and that is how we get the average fixed cost. $2.50 times 30 cents is $2.80. That's where our average cost, average total cost curve comes from. Our average total cost. It comes from the average variable plus the average fixed. So there's our variable cost curve. Those are our variable costs. I now want to draw this curve for you. So let's think about the variable cost curve for a minute. Clean all this up. And I'm going to insert back in the average fixed cost. Remember our average fixed cost? Starting high, getting lower, 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 lower. That's the average fixed cost. But look at the average variable cost. This one, the average variable cost is a little bit trickier. And the reason it's a little bit trickier is because we need to insert into, when we're looking at our average variable cost, we need to do this. We need to put as we've said, we need to look at our quantity, and we need to look at our variable cost, and this will give us our average variable cost curve. But what is it about column 2 that gives this average variable cost curve a kind of a weird shape? Well, think about this. When we had no workers, we had no output. But then when we got one worker, that worker turned 0 into 40. So that worker actually added 40 units to production. And then when we added worker 2, that worker has turned 40 into 90. So they've added 50 units of production. And worker 3, what does worker 3 add? Worker 3 adds 30 units of production. What does worker 4 add? 10 units of production. And what does worker 5 add? 5 units of production. So what we have here is in this column, just to the right of the quantity column, is a column that we might call the marginal. We can call it the marginal quantity, or probably a better name is the marginal output column. It's the marginal output, or we could call it the marginal product column. Product, really we mean production, the marginal level of production. And if we think about the numbers in this column, as we read the numbers down in that marginal product column, as we read the numbers down in this column, think about what's going on here. I'm going to clean it up, then I'm going to insert them again. So what numbers are we putting in here? We're putting in 40, then 30. All right, there's 40, 50, 30, 10, and then 5. So what can we notice about this? Well, when we were employing worker 1 added 40, but worker 2 added 50. So the marginal product actually went up. It went from 40 to 50. But then after worker 2, when we added worker 3, it started to go down. Down, goes from 30, from 10 to 5. So if I'm drawing this marginal product column, what's going on with the marginal product? It's rising and then it's falling. It's rising and then it's falling. Why would it be rising? Why would it be rising maybe between these first two workers? The reason it's rising between those two workers is because as we start to add workers into our workplace, we can separate the labour. We start to specialise within our business. We give a specific job to one person and then another job to another person. And as a result of concentrating on their job, as a result of that specialisation effect, for a while, these workers get more efficient, right? So this is a specialisation effect. And what is the effect? It makes the marginal product bigger. All right, it turns 40 into 50. However, that does not continue because after a while, that marginal product then starts to fall. All right, so the marginal product is falling. Why is it falling? It's now falling because we're adding more and more workers into this fixed space, and so it starts to become overcrowded. Workers are now competing to use the equipment in the fixed space, and so now our marginal product is falling, and we give this a name as well, and the name we give this, when the marginal product is falling, the name we give it when our marginal product is falling like this, we call this the law of diminishing returns. Or it's another way of saying our low-hanging fruit principle. That for a while, our production rises pretty quickly because we're basically capitalising on the low-hanging fruit. We're getting the most out of our fixed resources quickly. But then after we keep adding workers, it becomes more and more difficult to keep expanding production. So I'm going to go back now and I'm going to draw this curve, and so think about then what's going on with the variable average variable cost. This average variable cost, think about what's going on over here. Between 1 and 2, the average variable cost falls. Why does the average variable cost fall? Because the marginal product is rising, right? We're getting a rising marginal product, and that's making us more efficient. So our average variable cost curve is falling. But then the law of diminishing returns starts to take effect, and our marginal product starts to fall, right? So our marginal product starts to fall. And as a result of that marginal product falling, the average variable cost starts to rise. So if I want to draw that average variable cost curve, the average variable cost curve looks like this. Between worker 1 and worker 2, it falls. And then after worker 3, 4, 5, it starts to rise. So we have a curve that falls and then rises. That's our average variable cost. Why is it falling? It's falling, the red arrow. Why is it falling? Because of specialization. Why is it rising? Because of the effect of diminishing returns. So we have two things happening. Falling at first, then rising. And just contrast that, just to revise where we did before. The other curve is our average fixed cost curve, and our average fixed cost curve just falls and falls and falls. So we've got these two curves, and they've got two different shapes. So I've spent some time doing that because I want you to be thinking about why these curves have the shape that they do. So then let's just go back to our notes. So we have fixed resources. We know what they are, the ones that don't change when we vary our output. And then we have variable resources. For example, in most firms, or in many firms, that most variable resource will be its labour. The labour is the variable resource, and of course, that variable resource is what leads to the variable cost. When we buy or hire that variable resource, we generate a cost to the business. So then once we understand the difference between variable cost and fixed cost, we then have to start thinking about a new concept. And the new concept is time. In our analysis in our market analysis, we've basically got two periods of time. One is called the short run, and one is called the long run. So I'm going to try and explain the difference between the short run and the long run. When we think about the short run or long run, we are not thinking about any specific period of time. We're not thinking about 1 day, 2 days, 1 month, 10 years. We're not thinking about that at all. What we're thinking about when we contemplate short run and long run, we define short run and long run by using the word fixed factors and variable factors. So, if a business is going quiet, imagine that a business goes into a quiet season. It might be a business by a busy beach, but in the winter the weather's lousy, not many people come to the beach, not many people go to the business. And so, what will the business do? They are likely to lower the amount of staff in their business. Imagine the business is a hotel or restaurant, something like that. What would that business do in the wintertime? They'd probably lay off some of their staff. So that they could vary their staff. They can change the staff. However, there may be some things about the business which they can't change. For example, they might have a lease, and that lease might go for a year. And although they could potentially get rid of the staff during winter, they could get rid of all the staff in winter and just close the cafe. But what they can't do in a short period of time, perhaps, is get rid of the cafe altogether, because the cafe may be on a rental lease for a certain period of time, or even if the owner owns the cafe, it would still take some time to sell the business or sell the building that the business is in. So what is the long run? Long run is long enough to get rid of or acquire fixed factors of production. It's long enough to change the fixed factor. In other words, in the long run, nothing is fixed, because you can change anything in the long run. But at the moment, we're really thinking about what's it like in the short run. So in the short run, I have a business, and the business exists, and I don't have enough time to get rid of the business. I don't have enough time to sell the equipment in the business or sell the building that the business is in. I am stuck with the business in the short run. That's what the short run is. I can, however, change the variable factors of the business. So I may not be able to change the business, but I can change the number of staff I employ in the business. So that's what we mean by the variable factor. So in the short run, I can change the staff, but I can't change the building. So that's a way that you could think of operating in the short run. And what that means is that I have the business whether the season's good or bad. I can't get rid of the business. So I've basically got two choices. Choice one is to open the business every day and operate the business, or choice two is to put a closed sign on the business. Now, a closed sign on the business means the business is still there, but it's closed. So these are the decisions that firms face in the short run. They only have that basic decision to make initially in the short run. So what decision does the firm make in the short run? The firm is either open or closed. Now, when we say it's closed, right? Closed, another way of saying closed is to say the business is shut. Right? The business is shut. You see this at various times when you turn up at the business. You think the business is open and that there's a closed sign on the door. Well, when that happens, the term we're going to use for that is it's shut down. It's not open. So those are the decisions that the firm has to make in the short run. Will we open or will we close? So I'm going to insert some slides now. There will be some slides later on, which I am going to ignore. Right? I'm going to go past them. There's some of our textbook slides, and I'm just going to choose to explain the concepts in a slightly different way. So for the moment, I'm talking about the decision to open and close. We're talking about the decision to open and close. So think about our fixed costs, right? We have two fixed costs. We have two costs. Our fixed costs, and variable costs. Our variable costs are our labour and our other inputs that change when we operate our business. So imagine that in the short run, your variable cost is greater than your revenue. All right? Your variable cost is greater than your revenue. And however, it's not big enough to cover all your costs. Your revenue is great enough to cover your variable cost, but not all your cost. So if you open your business, this is what you do. Your business is open. Your variable cost is greater than your, I'll rewind here. Yes. I'll just take this out for a minute. If your variable cost is greater than your revenue, then you are going to make a loss, right? A loss compared to your variable cost. And as well as that loss, you will also have to pay your fixed cost as well. So we add the fixed cost. So that means that if you were to open, right, if you open, you have two losses. You have the fixed cost, and then you have the loss relative to the variable cost. So if you open, the loss is greater than the fixed cost. If you open, the loss is greater than the fixed cost. On the other hand, if you close down, if closed, what happens? Then the revenue equals 0. The variable cost equals 0. And the fixed cost is the only cost. And what that means is, if you are closed, then the loss will equal your fixed cost. So the firm has a choice, right? If the firm has a choice, if business is bad. One, if business is bad, and if the business is bad and the firm opens and the variable cost is greater than the revenue, the loss will be greater than the fixed cost. But if the business is closed, the revenue will be equal to the fixed cost, and so the loss will be lower. The loss will be lower. So the loss is lower than open. The loss is lower than open. So I'm going to add another couple of slides here. I'm going to add another couple of slides. So now I've got my shutdown rule, right? I've got my shutdown rule. So this is my shutdown rule. Here's our shutdown rule. Firstly, if revenue is greater than fixed cost or equal to the fixed cost, if revenue is greater or equal to the variable cost, you are open. Right? The firm is open. Why are you open? Because if revenue is greater than the variable cost, you make a little profit, right? You make a little profit on this part of the business. You make a little profit on there, and that pays some of the fixed cost, pays some of the fixed cost. And if that's the case, the loss is less than the fixed cost. It's less than if you closed. So if revenue is greater than the variable cost, you should open. That's the open rule. So we look at the variable cost and then we decide, and we look at our revenue and we decide whether we're open. On the other hand, if revenue is lower than the variable cost, firms should shut down. Firms should shut down. Why? Because then, why should they shut down? Because the loss is equal to the fixed cost, right? It's equal to the fixed cost. And then, so we'd say that the loss is minimized, right? This is called loss minimization. So this is a strategy that firms have to decide what they're going to do when businesses are bad. If businesses are going through a short-term bad period, being open will lose money. Being closed will lose money. What the firm has to decide, there are no good options under this situation. The firm's going to lose money for a short period of time. What this is about is minimizing the loss. It's choosing the second worst option here. And so that's what we mean by the loss minimization strategy. It only happens in the short run because in the long run, there's a third option, right? So first option, right, is keep the business open. Second option is keep the business closed, and that will depend on the revenue and whether it's greater or less than the variable cost. But the third option opens up in the long run. In the long run, the firm has the ability to sell the business altogether. So in the long run, if the lease runs out, the firm can choose to end the lease, or in the long run, the firm might be able to sell the business sell the building that the business is in. Now, so what that would mean is, in the long run, the business might not exist at all. But what we're talking about at the moment is not the long run. We're talking about the short run. So I'm just going to transition back, and I'm going to draw one more little illustration to explain maybe one last aspect of this. So there are three possibilities in our business, right? There's three possibilities. I'm going to draw the three possibilities. Here's our business. So a firm could be open, a firm could be closed. And what does this mean? We'll be open if the revenue is greater than the variable cost. It will be closed if the revenue is less than the variable cost. Those are our two short-run options. They are our short-run options. This is what happens in the short run. When we get to the long run, here's our business. Sold. All right. In the long run, we can get rid of our business altogether. And we don't call that open. We don't call it closed. We call it exit. Right? Exit. So you cannot exit in the short run. There's not enough time. But in the long run, you can exit. So that's our shutdown rule. And our shutdown rule relates to what happens in the short run. So we a few slides back, we define the difference between short run and long run. And one aspect of the short run and long run is deciding what to do if we're losing money. So we'll come back to that principle a little bit later. So the next thing I want to do then is go back to our table, and I want to go to this slide. It's a few slides back. I know we're jumping backwards and forwards, but the reason I'm doing this is because I want to do each aspect of cost thoroughly with you. So yes, we have looked at our shape of our fixed cost curve. We have looked at the shape of our average variable cost curve, like that. And now we're going to look at our marginal cost curve. It's the last one. It's the last of our curves. So remember what the marginal cost is. That when we're thinking at the margin, right? When we're thinking at the margin, what we're thinking about is this marginal means the extra worker. All right, we're thinking about the extra. Marginal means extra or additional. So I go back to my table and I'm working out the cost of producing extra coffees. So I've done the calculation on this table. I've done the calculation on the table. We can work out the average cost of our coffees. We've got the average cost of our coffees in the second last column. But the last column is not so much about the average as about the marginal cost. So this is a little bit different. So the way that we do this is we say, what is the additional cost? What is the change to the total cost? How much does the total cost go up when the quantity goes up? So if we look at the second line, we know that when we add an additional worker, we go from worker 1 to worker 2 in the second column. Our output goes from 40 to 90. So I'm going to circle the 50 because that is the additional quantity. That's the additional quantity. And then we have to think about, well, what was the additional cost? The additional cost of the second worker was $12 more. So now I get that $12, and that's the change in the total cost. So now on our right-hand column, we've got $12. That's the additional worker, 50 extra coffees. So those 50 coffees cost 24 cents extra per coffee. Those additional coffees cost 24 cents extra a coffee. By the time we get down to the last worker, which I'll do in green, by the time we get down to the last worker, when we added worker 5 from worker 4, that worker only added 5 extra coffees. So we'd say, well, there's a 5 extra coffees, but the worker costs us $12 extra. There's a mistake here. So that would be 12 over 5. So those extra coffees cost $2.40. So what I would like you to notice about the right-hand column, the marginal cost column, is this. You can see that the marginal cost fell at first. Why did it fall? It fell from 30 to 25. The reason the marginal cost fell is because over on the left-hand side, the marginal product rose. The second worker added more than the first worker. So we paid the second worker the same as the first worker, but they actually added more to production. But then why did the marginal cost curve start to rise? Because each additional worker was costing us $12, but of course the marginal output was falling. So as the marginal output falls, the marginal cost rises. They're the same concept flipped over. The law of diminishing returns, as your returns diminish, your costs get bigger. So that explains the cost of that marginal cost curve. So now we have the shape of three curves. We can draw the shape of three curves here. So what's the marginal cost curve look like? Think about it here. The marginal cost curve starts at 30. I've put a dot there. Then it falls to 24. Then it rises to 40. So the marginal cost curve is rising as our output. It falls a little bit at first, but then it rises at the end. So that's the shape of our marginal cost curve. So we've explored on the way through, we've had a good slow look at this table because we want to know why the numbers change in the way they do. So just as we work across the table, more workers will add more quantity, but that quantity changes more slowly as we add workers. That's the law of diminishing returns. Our fixed costs don't change, but our average variable cost falls a bit at first. Why is that? Because this over on the left-hand side, workers number 1 and 2 have a little specialization effect, so they're getting more efficient. But then the average variable cost starts to rise, and the same influence causes a change to our marginal cost. Our marginal cost falls at first. Why does it fall at first? Because over on the right-hand side, our marginal output is rising, but then later it starts to fall. Why does it fall? It starts to fall because of the marginal cost starts to rise because of the falling marginal output. So that's the way that one aspect of the column affects the others. All right, so we've done the short run, long run. We've done our shutdown position. I think I'm going to go past this slide. I'm not quite sure what Alberto was getting to on these slides. I'm going to come back to these slides when we do our equilibrium. Let me just go through a little bit further. I'll come back to these slides later. At the moment, I want to deal with the issue of profit. So profit is the difference between the total revenue and the total cost. And I'm going to work on this a little bit as we go down into our diagrams at the end. So at the moment, what are we doing today? We are really doing costs today. We're doing variable costs. We're doing average variable cost. We're doing fixed cost. We're doing average fixed cost. And we're doing total cost. And we're doing average total cost. So if I add variable cost, let me just use the eraser here. If I add our variable cost and we add it to our fixed cost, we get our total cost. If we put our variable cost over our quantity, then we'd get our average variable cost. And if we add our average variable cost to our average fixed cost, we would get our total cost, average total cost. So we can get our average total cost two ways. These are the ways that we can get our average total cost. We can just get the total cost and put it over the quantity. Let's do that on our table. How can we find the average total cost? We could simply get, I'll take a line here, I'll underline a line in red. How could we get an average total cost? We could get 136 and put it over 120. 136 over 120 is going to give us $1.13. That's one way of getting our average total cost. How do we do this? We simply got the total cost and we put it over the quantity. That's one way of getting our total cost. The other way of getting our total cost is to add the average variable cost. So on this slide, clean it up. How could we get our average total cost? If we add across here, we'd simply say, or the line above is probably better, getting our average variable cost, adding our average fixed cost, and here is our average total cost. So we can get to our averages two ways. So one way is total cost over the quantity, or the other way is, as I said, get the average variable, average fixed, and that will also give you the average total cost. All right, so we've been through the shutdown position, so I'm not going to restate the shutdown position. What I'm going to do for the rest of the lecture is talk to you in more detail about our cost. I'll go briefly. These are Alberto's slides. So what Alberto's basically saying here is the firm should shut down, right? The firm should shut down if production involves a loss that's greater than the fixed cost. So the firm should shut down, as I said before, if the revenue is greater than the variable, if the revenue is less than the variable cost. The revenue is less than the variable cost. Otherwise, if the revenue is greater than the variable cost, then the firm should hire some workers and continue the operation. So this is the open rule. And you do that if the revenue is greater than the variable cost. So this is just restating the rule that I discussed with you before. In the long run, the shutdown position does not really apply in the long run. And the reason the shutdown condition doesn't apply in the long run is because all factors can be varied in the long run, and therefore the firm could eliminate all costs, right? You could just sell the business. All costs, right? The firm can eliminate all costs. In the long run, you just get rid of the business. So the shutdown position does not really apply in the long run. If you are shutting down in the long run, you're basically selling the fixed factors and we no longer call it the shutdown position then. We call that exiting the business, exiting the industry. All right, now, if we think about our tables that we've done here today, what we can see on our table is this, that I can see that one worker can supply 40 goods. I can see that two workers supplies 90 goods. I get three workers, they supply 120 goods. What this table does not tell me is this. What if I had 1.5 workers, right? What if I had one worker on full-time and the other worker on part-time? I know nothing about what goes on between production unit 40 and 90. So what we've got on our table is discrete numbers of workers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 workers, but we don't have any ability to say what the influence of part-time workers is. So when we come to graphing this, when we come to graphing it, we can see, I'm going to put some black dots here, that these black dots here show us what's going on when we have one worker. The second dot, which I'll do in red dots, these red dots show us what's going to happen between two workers. But between these 2 points, we don't know what's going on. So we just draw straight lines. So this is what we call a discrete curve. It's a discrete curve because it's happening at discrete points of output. So we know what's going on at 40, we know what's going on at 90, we know what's going on at 120. What we don't know is what's going on between 40 and 90, or between 90 and 120. So our curve is it's not really a curve at all. It's a series of straight lines. One straight line, then one straight line, then another straight line, then another straight line, and another straight line. So this is called a discrete curve. It's called a discrete curve. If we did know what was happening at every level of production, then we don't have discrete curves anymore. We have a curve, we just have continuous curves. So we're not going like that anymore. We've simply got the continuous curves that we have on the right-hand side. Of continuous curves on the right-hand side. So I'm going to insert slides. What I'm going to do on this slide is just do exactly what is on the slide before you, but I'm going to draw it and I'm going to try and produce it on a slightly larger scale so that I can illustrate to you what's happening with all of these curves. So I'm going to draw a couple of axes here. Here's my first axis. On this curve before us, there's one curve that actually isn't present. You will remember that from the table, I drew an average fixed cost curve. And the average fixed cost curve started high, and then it just gets progressively lower, 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 and lower. Why do I have that average fixed cost curve? Because I want to explain the average total cost curve. So we know the average fixed cost curve slopes down because we're spreading the fixed cost. And here is our total cost curve, right, ATC. It comes down and it goes up. Here is our variable cost curve. So we know that our variable cost curve is not the same as our fixed cost curve because our average total cost minus our average fixed cost would equal our average variable cost. In other words, the difference between our fixed cost and our variable cost is, the difference between our total cost, which I'm marking as a dot, and our variable cost, that distance is our fixed cost. So I've shown that on the curve at the bottom. I haven't drawn the curve at the bottom perfectly. I'll try and sort of do that a little bit better. So the red interval that I'm circling at the bottom is the same as the red interval I'm circling at the top. The difference between the average variable cost and the average total cost is the average fixed cost. That is why these curves are not parallel. That's why these curves are not parallel. Why is the difference between the total cost and the variable cost so big on the left-hand side? Well, the reason is because the average fixed cost is also large on the left-hand side. These are not to scale, but those two black distances should be the same distance. They are the average fixed cost. So you can see from this diagram, what you can see is this, that at the low ranges of output, I've just drawn in black, the fixed cost is a big part of the cost. But on the left-hand side, at the high ranges of output, the average fixed cost is not a big part of the cost. Most of the cost over here, most of the cost on the right-hand side, at the high ranges of output, most of those costs are variable costs. So the combination of fixed cost and variable cost does change as we increase our output. So I'm going to go down and I'll redraw this a bit now. So I'm going to draw your various diagrams. I'm not going to put the average fixed cost curve in again. But what we did see was the average variable cost curve. It comes down. Why is it coming down? It's coming down because of the specialization effect, but then it starts to rise. Why does it rise? Because of the law of diminishing returns. So that is the average, fixed cost. No, sorry, the average variable cost. So we'll label it average variable cost. I'm now going to draw the average fixed cost. The average total cost. Here's our average total cost. Getting closer and closer, not parallel, because the average total cost gets closer and closer because the average fixed cost, which I've just shown a little green dash there, that average fixed cost is getting smaller. And then we've got a third cost, the marginal cost. It falls a little bit at first. Let's draw it in green. The marginal cost, it falls a little bit at first, and then it comes up, it cuts the average variable cost at the bottom of the average variable cost curve. It then keeps coming. It crosses the average total cost at the bottom of that curve, and then it continues up. Why is the marginal cost rising? The marginal cost rising because the marginal output is falling, right? But the marginal output, of course, is not on our diagram. So we've got our three curves here, and then I want to talk about what the firm is actually going to produce. What is the rule for the firm producing? So I come back over, I want to go back to our columns for a minute. So just bear with me as I go back to the columns. I'll try and find a clean version of the column. I'm now going to talk to you about what the firm will actually produce, how much the firm will produce. So I'm going to come down to this version of it, I think. Excuse me here, just for a minute. I'm having trouble adjusting my screen size here. All right, I'm going to do this a different way. I'll come down to the bottom to our diagram. Excuse me for this. All right, here's our diagram. Now, so we've drawn our diagram. So I'm now going to go to our rule for production, right? Our rule for production. So here is the rule. Let me insert the slide. Excuse this. All right, our rule for production, I'm just going to insert a slide. We did this the other day, but I'm going to do it again, but I'm just going to draw it freehand here. So the firm will produce, if you think about a firm producing, we did this the other day. If the price has to be equal to or above the marginal cost curve for the firm to produce, right? So the firm produces where the price is equal to or above the marginal cost. Why does the firm produce there? Because this price covers this cost. So that is our rationale for producing. That price covers that cost. So let's come over here to our diagram, and I'm going to illustrate this now by inserting different prices. I'm going to insert different prices. So imagine that I have a price here, right? That's P. What I do is I come across to our marginal cost curve, and that will be the quantity that I produce. So I'm producing at P, I'm producing Q. But what you will notice at P is this, that this price is above the average cost curve. I'm drawing a dot curve, a dot there. That price is above the average variable cost curve, but actually it's below the total cost curve. So what's going on at P? What's going on at P is that at this point, the firm is, in the short run, it's making a loss. It's making a loss, but it's open. Right? It's making a loss, but it's open. Why is it open? Because this price is different to the cost, where I'm drawing a blue dot. So the loss is equal to the blue interval. The loss per good is equal to the blue interval. Why is that better than shutting down? Because the difference between the variable cost and the total cost is the fixed cost. So if the firm shut down, the firm would lose the black amount, but if the firm stays open, the firm will lose the blue amount, the smaller amount. So this firm is open, but it's minimizing its losses. Now, what if the price was here, right? This is P1. What's going on there? Well, at this point, that price is now equal to the total cost curve. So that price is equal to the total cost curve. In other words, it's breaking even. This is the break-even point. The firm is breaking even, and this firm is not going to produce at Q anymore. This firm is now going to produce at Q1. That firm is going to now produce at Q1, and it's breaking even. Next, what if the price goes to P2? If the price goes to P2, the firm, why is it changing its output? Because the firm is equating its price to its marginal cost. The firm comes out here to Q2. Firm comes out there to Q2, where it cuts the axis. So the firm comes down to Q2. Now, this firm is actually making a profit. Let me show you the profit. Here is the price. Here is its average total cost. So that dark interval there is now the firm's profit per good. So what's going on here is this. There's a bigger lesson here. There's a bigger lesson. I'll try and clean this up. There's a bigger lesson here. That this firm looks at P. I'm circling P. It comes out to its marginal cost curve and then drops the line down to Q. And so at P, this firm is producing Q. At P1, we retrace the line out from P1. We drop it down to the quantity axis. Now this firm is producing Q2. And then what about P2? P2, we go out from P2, we go to the marginal cost curve, and we drop down to Q2. So what is this marginal cost curve actually doing for us? What's this marginal cost curve actually doing? What we're doing each time is we're finding the price, we're going to the marginal cost curve, and then we're going to our output. So this marginal cost curve is connecting our price and to our output, so which means that this marginal cost curve is our supply curve. So how do we know how many to supply? We know how many to supply by finding the price and going out to our marginal cost curve. So that marginal cost curve is telling us how much to make. However, I'm going to now insert another slide, and we say, is that always the case? Is it always the case? So let's insert another slide here. And we have to ask the question, is it always the case? So I'm going to draw what we just saw before us. And we have our average variable cost. We have our average total cost. I'm just going to draw the average variable cost curve a little bit differently. Average variable cost, we have our marginal cost. We saw that at P2. Q2. We saw at P2. At P, we have Q. We could call this P1, Q1. So this marginal cost curve is our supply curve, except I don't want to look at that part of the marginal cost curve. I don't want to look at that part of the marginal cost curve. I now want to look at this part of the marginal cost curve. the marginal cost curve at the bottom. Why am I looking at this part of the marginal cost curve? Because this part of the marginal cost curve, in this range down here, the price would be lower than the average variable cost curve. I'm circling the average variable cost curve. We trace the black line of the average variable cost curve. This price is a special price because this is the price where we shut down. If we've got a price that's anywhere in the blue range, right? If any price in this blue range, we're in a situation where the average cost curve is actually above the price. So under these circumstances, the firm will produce nothing. The firm will produce nothing. So actually, I can take that part of the curve out. And so when we talk about the marginal cost curve being the supply curve, not all of the marginal cost curve is the supply curve, because the firm will never sell for a price lower than what I'm indicating, and it will never supply a quantity lower than what I am indicating either. So this firm, yes, firms need money to produce, but what's going on with the firm in this situation is until the price gets to here, it's not worth the firm making anything because it hasn't reached the position where it would open. It hasn't reached a position where it will cover its average variable cost. So this is called the shutdown point, right? I don't think I've got room to write it in. Maybe I do. Right, that's called the shutdown position. So now we can more or less, we can pretty much finish our lecture off here. So when we're talking about the supply curve, here's our last slide for today. The part of the marginal cost curve above the average variable cost curve is part of the supply curve. So that's the part of the marginal cost curve above the average total cost curve, right? Above the average total cost curve. That will allow us to survive in the long run, because the part of the marginal cost curve above the average total cost curve, that's a viable spot for the firm to exist over a longer period of time. So I'm going to finish the lecture there. There's quite a lot of concepts in there. We have looked at the cost curve. At the end of the lecture, we've looked beyond the cost curve and we've started to look at the relationship between costs and prices. Prices are money that flows into the firm. When the firm charges a price, it earns revenue. That is revenue. And then the firm compares its revenue to its costs. In the short run, sometimes the revenue might be less than the costs, but the firm will still stay open to minimize its losses. But in the long run, the revenue has to be greater than the costs. We haven't actually done a lecture on revenue yet. That comes on next week. So next week we're doing demand, and demand comes from consumers. Consumers pay for goods, and that becomes revenue for the firm. So we're doing demand next week, and then the week beyond that we're doing equilibrium, and that will allow us to explore some of the concepts that we've done today in a bit more detail. I didn't get to elasticity today. That's not a drama. I will do it. I will drop those elasticity of supply diagrams in at the end of elasticity of demand. We'll just do elasticity together as one unit. So thanks for your attention today, and I will see you all on Tuesday.